Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kanban. So by the end of this lesson, I hope that each and every one of you will be able to describe at least three aspects of Kanban. So just like last time, we're going to start with a reading, but we're going to start this one, no smoke and mirrors on this. This one directly applies. This is the philosophy that Kanban is based on. It's called the theory of constraints. And so I'm going to send you the Wikipedia article. And let's say 10 minutes. Like, understanding theory of constraints is really the key to getting how and why Kanban works the way that it does. So there it is. I'm going to put 10 minutes on the clock. Go. Don't worry about the applications section of the Wikipedia article. I'm going to skip right to the thinking processes part. If you've gotten through that article, check out the Kanban one. One more minute. Cool. So back together. Any takeaways? Any like immediate like, oh, interestings from either article?
I read at the bottom of the Kanban one that I saw there's like one blurb relating it to Agile where like Agile kind of borrows like the task boards and that from Kanban. So does that
Mhm.
kind of relate to like the cards? Like each team kind of sets up like here's a list of tasks for us, and then it's kind of
Yeah.
distributed.
The idea of a pull system in Scrum, like a Scrum board, is almost exactly like a Kanban board. The difference is that Kanban has whip limits and Scrum boards don't. But yes, they heavily borrowed that idea. And Kanban goes back to the 70s, the Toyota production system, but like the Toyota production system ideas were what influenced Agile. So like it's common to refer to Kanban as like an Agile framework, even though it's predates it by a good 40 years probably. Other things that stuck out to you in those two articles?
I thought it was interesting that there are actual limits to the work in progress. I mean, I've seen that. I mean, I've read that you're supposed to limit work in progress, but like that diagram they had in the Kanban article was really interesting because technically still a lot of work in progress, but like it's very specific to how much you can have.
Yeah, it's each step of the process gets limited.
Cool. So like breaks it up into smaller chunks pretty much.
Yeah. Well, what you're trying to do is model the steps of your workflow, whatever it is. Kanban doesn't have any opinions about what your workflow is. Scrum does, XP does. Kanban says, whatever you're doing right now, just make it visual. Just identify the steps. That's the first part of doing Kanban. Other things that jumped out to you?
I liked how the theory of constraints article boiled down like to like 3 key measurements: throughput, inventory, and operating expense. I think that's just a very like efficient and simplistic way of evaluating the business success.
Definitely. And we'll talk more about cycle time, which is well, I guess inventory doesn't really get talked about as much, although I do want to mention it briefly. Cycle time is probably the part that got borrowed the most heavily from TOC. What else?
I really like the concept of the thinking processes. Like you have clear sort of steps of how to work through a problem set out for you.
Yes. We talked about identifying constraints. I can go screen share, I guess. We talked about identifying constraints. Second step was exploiting constraints. Third step was subordinating, I believe. Fourth one is elevating constraints. And then the last one is repeat. All right, let's zoom back for a sec. So theory of constraints. Can anybody summarize what the theory of constraints is? Like one sentence version?
You're only as strong as your weakest link.
Yep. So another way to put that would be the throughput of any process, how much is able to get through it, is always constrained by at least one thing. If it wasn't, you'd have infinite production. You'd be able to get an infinite number of things through the system were it not constrained by something. So what we're trying to do is figure out, first and foremost, where is the constraint? What is our constraining factor right now? Fixing anything else might make that process better, doesn't improve throughput on the system. And throughput through the system is ultimately the only thing we give a shit about. And so we talk about throughput through the system. That could be like this came from manufacturing. So that might be how many cars came off the line today. It could also be how many students graduated the program. It could also be how many chores did I get done today. You can model all of those things as a system that has a certain amount of throughput to it. And were it not for some factor, we would be able to graduate infinite students, graduate or do infinite laundry. There's something that's stopping us from that. And fixing something that isn't the constraint doesn't improve the throughput on your system. Only fixing stuff that the constraint does. So that's our theory of constraints. These other steps are ways that we improve it. And that's like a little bit beyond the scope of Kanban, but briefly, exploiting a constraint is finding a way to do it more efficiently. Whatever you're doing now, can it be done better? Subordinating is, all right, well, if fixing the constraint is the only thing that gets us more throughput through the system, then that would also imply that we have excess capacity in other parts of the system. So this means, like in practice, taking somebody off of some task that they're doing and moving them on to the task that's the constraint right now. That's subordinating. And then elevating is hiring more people, getting another washing machine, getting like actually introducing new resources. And you do these steps in order. You make something efficient, you reorganize, and then you get more resources in that order. And it's way too common to jump right to getting more resources when there's plenty of efficiency to be had, when there's plenty of people standing around with their thumbs up their asses. They jump right to hiring more people, getting more machines, whatever. So this is a systematic process that we're improving a system. And a great tool for organizing that work is Kanban. If I put it simply, Kanban's a system where we're modeling any process as a series of steps and then putting limits to how much stuff, artificial limits that we're making up on how many things are allowed in that step of the process at any given time. There's usually at either end of it a backlog and a done. And historically, you do this with physical cards. You take sticky notes or index cards or something like that, throw them all in the backlog. And the point of Kanban is, as capacity frees up at the later steps, as things move, if I have 3 things here, and I've got 2 here, and 2 here, and 1 here, and 3
Are each of those different columns like a different team?
Could be research, planning, executing, testing, delivery, like QA, delivery. And those could be different functions with the same 3 people. That could be, all of those are different teams. Kanban will work for any of that. And then these are generically called work items. They could be user stories, don't have to be, just tasks. Things that independently move through the system. Could be widgets, car parts, students, whatever you produce, work items.
So would one of those cards there in that first column of 3, when it's complete, would it skip automatically to done, or is it moving across this funnel?
It's moving across. So
Got
what
it.
happens is, cool, this one finishes the process, and so it goes into done. And that means this one can move here. That means this one can move here. That means this one can move here. Means this one moves here. And then the next thing off the backlog moves into that. The difference, that's Kanban. The way that this works in most processes is the opposite. As soon as this team is done, they take on more work, regardless of whether or not there's capacity in this next step. It's a push process. It's how fast can we get this step done? And so let's say this is a crazy fast team or part of the process or whatever. This has a pretty low WIP. So we just start loading up this team as fast as this team can go. A couple things happen. Actually, I have a great slide for this from one of my Agile talks. I'll pull it up.
Would a decent analogy be that that graph almost kind of reminds me of like how the students move through this program, like from like one column to the next, pretty much.
Yep. Now, like we would be Kanbaning if you move on to the next mod or something like that when there's capacity for you. It's like, sorry, we only do 10 students in mod 3. So as soon as one of them moves to mod 4, we can move a mod 2 student into mod 3. If we were resource constrained and like how many students we could teach at once, that might be a thing that we did. So let me see if I can, I need to find, there it is, flow. All right, so a lot of organizations are trying to optimize for capacity. All right, and we have these resources. How do we keep them all busy? Kanban's the opposite of that. Kanban is like, or it's just a different focus. It's how do we get the most things through the system as possible, not how do we keep all of our machines running around the clock. And the problem with keeping everybody running around the clock, which is our push approach, get the work off your plate as quickly as you can. Couple things. The first one is that if everybody's running at capacity, a completely natural variation, like adding an extra piece of work, now jams the entire system. You're working on all of those things at once, and so nothing can get through. Versus, you're running with headroom. You're not running at capacity. You can accommodate all kinds of variation, and things can still get through the system. Nothing gets log jammed. And ultimately with Kanban, that's what we're trying to do, is improve flow through a system, not resource utilization. So instead of this team pushing work onto this team as quickly as they can, all right, they might not have anything to do. That's fine. We wait for this one to move on before we produce more work. And what that might mean is that, all right, sounds like we got to work on making this process more efficient. It might be some of the people who work on this step of the process need to help out over here. But we're not throwing work at a part of the process that doesn't have capacity to handle it. So in addition to impeding flow, another problem is inventory. So inventory, in this sense, is just anything that's in the middle of this process. All of these work items here are inventory. So what's the problem with inventory? Well, it turns out everything. So inventory goes bad. If it's like an organic product, it like literally decays. Also, like, let's say I teach you React for a job that you're going to have in 5 years. All right. Well, then 5 years rolls around and, oh, we're not using React anymore. Womp womp. That's an example of like abstract inventory going bad. So one of the ways we can eliminate that is by eliminating inventory. We want to keep our work in progress across the entire board as low as possible. We want to manufacture stuff that hasn't been bought yet. So like these like highly optimized just-in-time production systems like Walmart and all these people use. You buy some Pampers and that triggers at the factory them making another fucking pack of diapers. That's Kanban. A purchase was made and that triggered the production of the next thing. Not an anticipation, not a prediction, not a plan, pull system. That's heavy. Let that sit for a sec. We're not pushing work as soon as we can. We're pulling work as capacity allows.
I'm trying to envision a scenario where a push environment is actually, I guess, better.
Have you done so yet?
I can't think of any, so I guess that's more a question for you if you can think of any.
Nope. I will always prefer a pull system to a push system. This was like, so earlier in that Real Agile presentation, when I talked about this history of freedom and control, like this was the big realization that W. Edwards Deming and Taiichi Ohno like brought to the management world is this like holy shit about pull systems. It applies broad and wide. Questions about anything we've talked about so far? Thoughts, ahas?
So I actually have two thoughts on this.
Okay.
One, this pull system sounds like it would be really great for work-life balance. So if you get your products done, you can either help other people or take some time off or anything like that.
Sure.
That's cool. And the actual question I have is, what necessarily determines how many people are going to be on a team, or how many user stories or tasks is going to be in each? Is it like rated by complexity?
So you can do it that way. You could, like in traditional Kanban, all of your work items are supposed to be relatively similar size. And so the WIP limit just applies to the number of work items. You can also put sizes on these, and then your WIP limit applies to the size. I think like what you're really asking is like, how do you determine the WIP limit? And the goal is to make it as low as possible. And so you make it as low as you can without disrupting flow. And it takes some experimenting and it takes some searching. But like you mentioned user stories. Could be user stories, could also be cars. Like Kanban doesn't have an opinion on what that is. This is a direct application of like queuing theory, which is technically an economics idea. So this is like a very broad framework for processing any queue.
So each of those columns, is each column a feature or each row, or is all of it one feature?
So let's look at the simplest Kanban board. And like this is what personal Kanban is all about, is to do, doing, done, with a WIP limit of 1. That's the simplest Kanban board you can have. And this is what personal Kanban is. All your stuff goes over here. You're not allowed to work on more than one thing at a time. And when that's done, pulls the next piece in. That could also be backlog, requirements gathering, planning, executing, QA, and then like deployed and done. So, and then you could put WIP limits on these too. This is waterfall. This is the waterfall process modeled with Kanban. Now, what you might see in this process is like, oh man, we are doing an awful lot of planning and we can plan stuff super fast. We can't execute super fast though. So now we're generating a ton of inventory. And like planning is the worst one to have inventory on. Because if you're planning, if the distance between planning something and executing something is high, the chance that that plan no longer applies radically, like exponentially ratchets up as time goes on. The competitive environment changes, the legal environment changes, the person who was going to execute that thing quit. You have so many things that are completely outside of your control. So we don't want to plan something until we're ready to execute it. We don't want to execute something until there's somebody to QA it. So even with a waterfall process, we want to limit our work in progress so we can limit inventory. Now, what I love about modeling waterfall processes with Kanban is there's no loops. Something doesn't go from QA back to requirements. It always goes forward. But like that happens all the time, that QA kicks something back to executing. So to model that as a line, re-executing, re-QA. And then you do this as many times as you have ever done this, as many times as this is cycled before. So you do execute 3, re-QA 3. Model the entire process as a line. So now you've visualized your process. And so like our objective was to describe 3 aspects of Kanban. The first one that I would have you take away is visualize the work. Not tribal knowledge, not in a process document somewhere. Draw a fucking picture. Let's say something doesn't need to be re-QA'd or something. Cool. It can skip steps. That's completely fine if there's space downstream for it. Can't go back though. So what inevitably happens when you're using this Kanban board and you visualized your work, like, all right, well, our constraint is probably somewhere in this like QA, re-QA, redo. That's probably what's stopping the flow in our system. So you identify a constraint. First step is to exploit the constraint. Can we re-engineer this to be more effective? For example, what if executing and QA were part of the same step? So rather than we did this and now it's queued up waiting for QA people, what if there's a QA person paired with a developer and that QA process happens as something is being developed? Cool. Well, now we can get rid of our constraint. And now our constraint is something else. So in Agile, we do this by not having, you okay? We do this by not having a QA process, by writing the tests first, by pair programming, by doing PRs. That's our QA process. It's all part of doing the work. not a separate step. Agile, you'll hear about build quality in, as in like make it so that you can't do low quality things. That's an example of exploiting a constraint. But it gets a hell of a lot easier to recognize those kinds of things once it's a picture. Ask me some questions about that.
Would you have a QA step as part of your planning phase as well, just to make sure that you're planning for the right stuff, or you don't find yourself increasing that distance?
Oh, Johnny. Oh, Johnny. So I mentioned that we modeled out a waterfall process here. But yeah, you'd want your testing plan in place, like back here at requirements, right? It's almost like the entire problem is the phases. So as trying to exploit constraints on this process, you end up boiling it down to the phaseless agile process, where all we have is I'm working on a story, including the requirements and the getting the resources that I need. And those resources should be on my team. I don't need to requisition them from another department or something. It's part of agile team composition. So I have those people on my team. We talk about what we need to do it, how we're going to do it. We might have a product owner or a scrum master, something who can help us with any external facing stuff that we need. We're writing our tests first to build quality into the product. We're looking at each other's code, which helps reduce errors. We have things like linters and code formatters that are making it so that you can't write code that doesn't meet the style guide. And then we PR it. And then somebody else from the team is looking at it. So that turns that into like 2 steps. It's like in dev and why am I using a mouse? I have a pen with me. So it's like in dev step and PR'd. And maybe you say, all right, we only want 2 PRs open at once. So if we have 2 things waiting to be reviewed in PR, sure doesn't make sense to pick up any more tickets. We've already subordinated the constraint, or sorry, we've already exploited the constraint. We've boiled this crazy fucking phase process down we made this as efficient as we can make it. So now it's time to subordinate the constraint. Instead of picking up the next story, your goal is to clear flow, man. Get this PR'd thing reviewed and out of here. That gets that out, which makes room for your next story. And now, like part of subordinating it was also like, these aren't 2 different teams. They're not different people. The dev team is working both of those columns. There's a belief in the Agile community that I vaguely agree with, that Kanban is the easiest way to get a team to become Agile. Model their goofy ass waterfall process exactly as it is, and then coach them to the real thing. Questions?
This is kind of an observation, but this makes me think a lot of the coffee industry, because every single step, considering how long it takes to grow trees, how long it takes to roast and go through the processes, and how delicate coffee can be, they have QA through the entire process. They are constantly working on efficiently making changes to roast levels, how they process it, because it's expensive and you can't exactly unroast coffee. So maybe that's the constraint that makes them that way. But this is a lot like what you would go through to any step in the coffee industry.
Absolutely. Also, like I imagine coffee goes bad at some point. So you don't want to have inventory, especially if, a pandemic hits and all of a sudden it's harder to sell your product and you're just sitting on a bunch of shit.
Mm-hmm.
Way better to do the investment up front so that when somebody purchases a cup of coffee, that sends a signal way back, all the way back to the like growing process as like, okay, do we have trees to cover this? Do we need to not replace a tree or a bean? I don't fucking know how coffee works. You want that entire process to be integrated. A lot better than I predict that people will buy whatever based on reality. Other ahas, questions? All right, so our 3 aspects of Kanban: visualize the work, limit work in progress, and one more. And it's about cycle time. There's 2 kinds of cycle time that we care about in Kanban. The first one is called, or sorry, one of them's cycle time, the other one's called lead time. So cycle time is how long through the system in time. So from when you start working on something to the time it comes out of the system, that's cycle time. And our goal with Kanban, one of the goals is reduce cycle time. We're concerned about flow. Cycle time is a way that flow is measured. If the average time that something sits in this process, potentially because it's been re-QA'd and then executed again and then re-QA'd, how long something sits in the system is a measure of how efficient it is. Lead time is how long from when something enters the backlog to when it exits. How long from when somebody buys the diapers at Walmart until there's new diapers on the shelf. That's lead time. Both of them are measures of flow. And we're trying to get both of them down as much as possible. The overall goal of Kanban is maximize flow as measured by lead time and cycle time. Visualize the work, limit work in progress, improve flow through the system, throughput. Ask me some questions. Give me some ahas.
I think my biggest aha is really just recognizing that my previous employer was almost like the exact opposite of Kanban.
Yeah, common.
And it is unbelievable. So I'm just kind of curious on, if they were interested, how they would go about kind of transforming their whole process or their whole system to a Kanban. Is it hiring outside consultants, or like what have you seen?
It often is, and this is the case with any kind of like agile thing, is you get coaches for it is like the most common way to do it. But that is also a part of the industry that is rife with just fucking charlatans. It takes about 9 hours to get certified as a Scrum Master or a PO, or like, it's kind of like, oh, my friends want me to marry them. Oh, I'm going to go through the rigorous divinity school of the Universal Life Church, and it's kind of like that. And so you have some like completely broken organization, and they go, we need to hire a coach to help this team do agile. And they hire a good coach, and they go, oh, well, the team is do agile, they are agile, and you're actually going to need to change a lot more than just what the dev team does. This involves the sales team process. This involves like how you compensate people, because if people get punished for not working, well, then we can't have any headroom in the process. And at that point, the broken company goes, no, I don't like that. Next. And they talk to another coach who goes, yeah, man, I can find a way to have you guys do Kanban without changing absolutely anything. They go, yeah, that's the guy that I like. So there's some moral hazard with agile coaching, but if the organization doesn't have that expertise, they're not going to. The phrase that happens in agile consulting a lot is like, the people who built the system can't fix the system. If they could, they would have done that already. So you need some kind of outside input. Deming called it a system of profound realization. And then the first step is, before they change anything, visualize the process. What does it look like right now? And then, using that tool, where are you constrained? And if you start fixing shit that isn't the constraint in their process, that's a really good way to get the people who do the work to not be on your side. Like, whoa, why am I the problem? Why are you worried about me? That person over there, this whole fucking thing is broken, and you're starting with me? So we identify whatever the constraint is. We try to make it better. We figure out if we can take resources out of other parts of the systems to make it not the constraint anymore. Then last case, buy more resources to help lift it. If any one of those lifts the constraint, makes it not the constraint anymore, we start over again. Where's the new constraint? That's why Kanban can be such a safe entry point for horribly broken organizations. Because starting with, they don't have to change anything. And then convincing them to change something becomes a lot easier, because you can visualize where the bottlenecks are happening. Visualize the work, limit work in progress, improve flow. More ahas and questions.
So Kanban still feels a little bit rigid compared to Scrum. Is there a way to sort of combine those two, or are they just mutually exclusive? Or is that XP?
That's
Or is
Scrumban.
Oh,
It's a whole thing. Although like Kanban really isn't rigid. It has no opinions about what your process is, only how you visualize it. Whereas like, if we'll think back to the Scrum talk from yesterday, sprints are between 1 and 4 weeks, but they average 2. On the first day of your sprint, you have a meeting where you take your backlog and you size them. You have to have these 3 roles on the team. They are allowed to do these things. They're not allowed to do these things. On the final day of a sprint, you demo and then do a retro. it's not a requirement in Scrum, but like you can size the stories as user points. We didn't talk about velocity yesterday, but that's one of our estimation tools. That's a fucking rigid process. And then with XP, there's a little bit less of that process kind of stuff, but you're not allowed to write code that doesn't have a failing test. You're not allowed to write code that doesn't have a pair. And some XP shops, like you don't even have individual computers. The computers are just set up at pairing stations, and that's where you code. You are not allowed to do anything unsafe. Unsafe is like not have a CI/CD pipeline. That's rigid. Other thoughts,
So,
comments, ahas? Yeah.
so I was a member of a Scrum team in my previous job. It was relatively new, but we had an experienced Scrum Master in, for context, a chronically under-resourced company. But what I'm realizing now is that like through her kind of like discipline and while everybody's complaining about the fact that we can't get anything done, is that by following kind of the Scrum rules, we were actually able to identify and document blocks to flow, which then meant that there was a case to add resources, in our case, to the design team. And I'm only just realizing that.
Yes.
So actually there is some overlap, I guess.
Oh yeah, having like a solid agile coach, worth their weight in gold, always.
Yeah, she came from IT, so.
Well, aluminium. All right. All right. So to wrap up, I would like you to Slack me your description of at least 3 aspects of Kanban. I'll give you a few minutes. I'll hang out on the call. Go. All right, slack me what you got. Paige, your answer was outstanding. Would you please read it out loud?
Yeah. Kanban is a system to model a process as a series of steps and putting artificial limits at each step in the process. These limits are supposed to be as low as possible without limiting flow. Kanban focuses on keeping things moving through the system by not trying to use all resources at full capacity, i.e. not pushing work as soon as we can, but pulling work forward when capacity becomes available. There are 3 high-level steps: visualize the work, limit work in progress, and improve flow.
Oh! Brava, brava, bravissima. So one last thing, I mentioned that our goal is that some activity on the receiving end of this, we want that to ultimately trigger something being pulled into the system. That's the ultimate pull system. Anybody pick up what the word Kanban means in Japanese?
Was it billboard?
Almost. Signal. So a Kanban card is a card that signals something. So in the Toyota production system, you'd have like a whole bunch of parts that were next to you. You do your part on the factory line and you move it on. You start running out of parts, you put a signal card or a Kanban on the conveyor belt. That makes its way down the line, and then the person at the supply depot sees that card on the conveyor belt and goes, cool, got it. Rushes them back over to the person so they refill their things. Signals. One more cool Kanban story. Kanbans are currently used in Japan for public parks. So you go into a park, you take the Kanban out of the gate, enjoy your wide open, spacious park. No cards available, you can't get in. On your way out, you put your Kanban card back and somebody else can take one. And that's how they limit inventory in their parks. All right, cool. So everybody's coming out. Thanks for hanging out with me.